while you turn on your videos, some of you still haven't, let's get started. So now we're going to do the last section or the last lecture for section 6, talking about the regulations aspect. I am by no means going to cover everything to do with regulations. I worked in biomedical device regulations in United States, so my experience is very limited to one section in regulations. Right? That was my industry experience in biomedical engineering. However, I will try to include everything, a summary of US, Europe, and Sri Lanka. I have asked, I know in your previous curriculum, you had someone from NMRA come and give a guest lecture. I know the previous curriculum had biomedical device regulations as one of the modules. I'm not familiar with the current curriculum, but I hope at least you will have one guest lecture from someone who's actively participating in regulations with NMRA. NMRA is the Sri Lankan authority. Okay. So we've come to the last sections. We'll talk about world standards, just 2 of them, and then the Sri Lankan standards, and hopefully we can finish. So first thing we're going to talk about is device classification. The device classification, some that are not covered, this is like the summary. What is regulatory control and why do you think regulation is needed? And how do you think this changes from country to country? Let's have a few answers. So forget biomedical engineering. When you think about regulations, why do you think regulations are needed at all? And based on the country, the rules can also change. So this is not a simple thing to explain. This I have taken from your textbook, The Life Cycle of a Medical Device. Have you done this? Have you done this yet? Either just nod your head or shake your head. Hayati. Not yet. But this is from the textbook, and I think you will do this later. So because it's from the textbook, you can read it. I'm not going to explain this in detail. But remember, I think right now you're in this stage. You're still looking at the user needs and the requirements included in that. So when you select your project, you should think about what are the regulatory requirements, not just the user need. You should think about the regulatory requirements in that, and then you start with the design. So I'll start off with the medical device classes. Before I start off with the classes, I have to talk about what is a medical device. So medical device, this is like an official definition. The instrument, apparatus, implementation, machine, appliance, implant, reagent for in vitro use, a software, a material, or other similar related article intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination for human beings for one or more of the following purposes: diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, alleviation of disease. Alleviation means to help make the symptoms better or the disease better. Diagnosis, monitoring, treatment, alleviation of or compensation for an injury. Right? That means all of anything that compensates for injury. Investigation, replacement, modification, or support of the anatomy of a physiological process. So we talked about pacemakers earlier. Prosthetics, these all come in this category. Supporting or sustaining life, right? Something that helps a person breathe. Control of conception. So any kind of birth control falls in this category. Disinfection of medical devices, right? Any kind of radiation you give to disinfect, any kind of disinfectant. providing information by means of in vitro examination of specimens derived from the human body. All of this, but it does not achieve its primary intended action by pharmacological or immunological or metabolic means. So that means like medicine that we usually drink as like pills, they're pharmacological. When they go in, they disintegrate and they get into different molecules and they do things in our human body. Those are not medical devices. But if you drink a pill that's supposed to take pictures of inside your body, now that's a medical device. But if the pill disintegrates into different metabolic things and integrates or does the main purpose by disintegrating and metabolically reacting with your body, that's not a device. Hopefully this gives you a better idea of a device. So that means a device is pretty much anything else other than pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic things. Right. So medical devices are categorized into different classes based on the country. In United States, it's called class 1, class 2, class 3. In Europe, it's class 1, class 2A, 2B, and 3. From 1 to 3, the risk increases. In Japan, you have 1, 2, 3, 4. I did have a group work. Let me see if I can skip this. But here's like an example of the different classes of medical devices. So wheelchairs, they fall onto class 1. So depending on the class that your medical device falls onto, the way that it gets approved in the regulatory process, it's different. Sri Lanka is very close to the EU standards. That's why I have shown this. But Sri Lanka also accepts United States. So this kind of is across the board. The EU classification is slightly different from United States and Japan and different countries, but this will give you an idea. So wheelchairs will be the lowest risk category. Walking aids, any walking stick, that's a medical device. Stethoscope that you listen to the heart or the lungs. Dental patient chairs are considered class 1. Class 2A is anything that's low risk but has a power source. So anything with a battery is considered class 2A. If it has any kind of power source, that's a class 2A. So hearing aids, and that's not the only category, but that's one example. Class 2B is usually things that are higher in risk. So there was one I wanted to share. Don't think I had it. So dressings for severe wounds is considered higher risk, but dressings, I think like Band-Aids and all fall under class 1. Just your regular plasters that you use for wounds. Then breast implants, pumps, the spinal stents and all, they fall into the highest risk category. Software, depending on its use, will be classified as A, B, and C. And the software, medical device software, is a whole different category. So if any of, again, I can't cover everything in 40 minutes, but if any of you are interested in this area, depending on where you work, you will have access to these documents. So like these documents, you have to pay like hundreds of dollars to access. But if you're in a company that's doing this, then you will have access to these. So as I said, class 1, low risk to the patient. Most of the devices that are out there in the market are class 1. These do not, so this 510K, I'll explain it later. They don't go through this 510K or PMA, pre-market approval stage. The manufacturer has to register it, and basically the manufacturer will decide what the risks are. And the manufacturer will say, this is the lowest risk class based on the requirements of the regulatory authority, this device falls into class 1 because of these reasons, and these are the risks. That's it. They only need to register the product. So here are some examples of that. This again, I have taken from your textbook, and the textbook actually explains it pretty well. So read these pages. And here I've given examples of it. Class 2, this is moderate to high risk. Again, I'm going to the USA classification. Europe, it will be class 2A and sometimes even 2B. About half of the devices fall in this category. Here you need a document called the 510K. I'll talk about what the 510K is in a moment. So powered wheelchairs fall. If the wheelchair does not have a power source, it's a class 1. If it has a power source, it falls under powered wheelchairs, which is class 2. They're non-invasive, but are complicated in design. And if they perform as expected, you're not expecting any harm or cause of injury to the patient. Right? And these, as I mentioned, the 510K process basically is the process or the documentation process that says you have to look at the market availability, you have to survey the market. Even after you put the product into the market, you have to do a post-market surveillance, and all of that needs to be included for class 2 devices. For class 1, you don't need to do that. Class 3, which is the highest risk, usually this is like the class 1, when you think about bandages, for example, just the what you use, the plasters, you make this in like millions. But when it comes to class 3, these are higher risk. Sometimes it goes through 1-to-1, 100% quality check, because you need to make sure that every single device, you lower the risk as much as possible. Only about 10% of devices fall in this category. Pacemakers we talked about, breast implants, because you're implanting something inside the human person. You can't just remove it. You have to do a surgery if something goes wrong, like the example that I gave earlier. Right. So here is that path that I talked about. I will actually skip this, and I'll talk about we'll come to some of these later. So yeah, let me explain this briefly. So whenever you have a new device, one of the things you want to check is, do you have a device or a product in the market that's equivalent to this? If it doesn't, then you have to start the process like from scratch. But if you have a product or a device that's similar to an existing product, basically you say this is substantially equivalent, and it goes through a different process. Right? So this is the new design. The intended use is substantially equivalent, and you can go through this simple process. If not, if the use is not the same, but you don't have to say, do the differences after the intended use the same or not? If not, you can still go through this process. If it's a completely new design, then it's not substantially equivalent, and you have to go through the entire thing all over again. When you get a guest lecturer from NMRA, they will explain this process specifically for Sri Lanka. So USA is not the hardest one. Japan is actually the hardest. If you have anything approved through Japan, chances are USA will also approve it. because the documentation and everything would be in order. So the USA body that approves it is called the US FDA, US Department of FDA stands for Food and Drug Administration. So US FDA has its own set of rules. Usually we call this the agency. In this case, the agency in USA is FDA. And the website that I gave you in the previous lecture is actually the FDA website. And this is within the Department of Health and Human Services, if you noticed. So FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring safety, efficacy, and security of all of these things. If you notice, medical devices are included, biological and tobacco products, human and veterinary food and drugs, cosmetics, products that emit radiation. So pretty much everything is covered in this. The registration process, this 510K is specific to United States. So the 510K is basically the pre-market notification. You submit it 90 days in advance to get clearance saying, okay, this product does not meet any other like substantial equivalency. So we are going to start the process for this particular product. And then you apply for pre-market approval, and then you go through the whole process. Again, in the book, in your textbook, because the textbook is specifically talking about US, it has the full pathway explained. Inside this, so once you do the 510K and the PMA, there's like a whole series of federal codes of federal regulations. There are 21 different documents. These are all, like most of them are legal jargon. Sometimes you have biomedical engineers who also learn law, some kind of law to actually go through these. There are people specializing in this, and this is their entire job to make sure that they submit these documents with the product. So if you're somebody who's interested in legal aspect and documentation, and you're good at biomedical engineering or the engineering aspects, you can get into this field. Inside these 21 titles, now, when I was a student for my PhD, I had to study each of these 21. And each of these 15 subparts we had to study. It didn't go to waste because this is the job that I ended up doing in the end. I'm not going to make you memorize all of this. I don't even know if you have a final exam. But if this was a regulatory class, you would actually need to study all of this. Again, this is an introductory class, just telling you what each of these things that are there. So hopefully, if you're interested in it, or if you're interested in getting a job in this area, you can look at these. Inside all of this, the particular path that applies to you, is Part 820, 21 CFR 820. Yeah, I don't know, I can't highlight this. Right? This is the CFR that applies to medical devices specifically. And inside this, you have these QSR, or the quality system regulations, that are 15 subparts that talk about the different aspects that you need to consider in your design, in your medical device. So these are the different things, including, if you notice, a statistical technique. How did you say, let's say you say that when it comes to a vaccine, this vaccine is actually helping people. Where are the statistics? Where's the statistical technique that you use? Where's the evidence to show that there is a statistical significance in all of this? So all of this you have to submit with your documentation. So this is the US standard. Then we come to Europe. Europe is not one entity. You have different countries having different, we could say, notified bodies. There are different regulatory authorities. Some countries in Europe are easier to get approval than other countries. Compliance is not mandated. So if you see the FDA requirement, you have to comply. You don't have an option. So that's why I said US is more difficult than Europe. The CE mark, it's more like guidelines. So it doesn't mean that they're 100% compliant. So if there's a CE mark, you have to check what are they compliant with. It's not a mandatory requirement. And depending on the notified body in Europe, so usually with the CE mark, you will see a 4-digit code, and that code will say which country or the notified body approved the CE mark or approved it, that it went through. In the European system, you have good manufacturing practices, GMPs or CGMPs, which say current good manufacturing practices. And again, you have a full list. This is similar to the QSR, very similar. The order might be different. Some things might be combined, but you have the ISO 13485 that lists all of this. Later on, when you go to industrial training, some companies that you go to might be following the ISO standards, so you can look at those. In Europe, you have the Medical Device Directive. Again, so many different ways that you can get your medical device approved. There are 18 different parts. For example, a needle is class 1, but the blood storing bag is not class 1. So depending on how you categorize it and depending on which way you want to go, there are 18 different paths you can take to get a medical device approved. And all of that is given in this 9342 EEC that talks about medical devices. And here, they also specify one of the things is that they care more than the patient, more than just the patient. So the user, the transporter, the person who's transporting this. For example, last time I said this example about x-rays. So here it's not just thinking about the user, the person who's pressing the button, but the person who's going to transport the radiation from one place to another. The poor driver who has to drive this from one hospital to the other hospital, you have to think about the safety of that driver as well. Finally, we come to the Sri Lankan standards, NMRA. So NMRA stands for National Medicines Regulatory Authority. Their website is currently under maintenance. It's been under maintenance ever since I got invited to do this lecture. Even this morning I checked, it was still under maintenance. But if you go to their website, hopefully it's under maintenance because they are adding a lot of regulations and documents to the website. Inside that, you will find the medical devices. Sri Lankan rule in 1980, the Cosmetics, Devices and Drug Act was in effect. And then in 2015, so very recently, not even 10 years ago, National Medicines Regulatory Act of NMRA Act of 2015 came into effect. And the National Medicines Regulatory Authority, NMRA, was formed as a part of the NMRA Act. And NMRA regulates and controls medicines, medical devices, borderline products, and clinical trials. And October 2019, they had a medicines regulations document that was published by NMRA. Currently, they should have the new medical devices regulations. Hopefully, when their website is up, they will have that available. There are 13 members in the authority, including the chairman, CEO, and 12 different divisions. Under the divisions, one division is the Medical Devices Regulatory Division. The Medical Devices Evaluation Committee, MDEC, comes under this Medical Devices Regulation Division. Especially during COVID, a lot of allegations were made against the NMRA. So this is something you should be aware of, because NMRA is an authority that controls medicines for all of Sri Lanka. So the criteria for registration in NMRA is that you should say, my device is safe, effective, and here is the quality. Then the MDEC, remember I talked about the MDEC, the evaluation committee, they will evaluate the need for this particular product and the price that you should set for it. And this is your criteria for registration. I was told a few years ago when I checked that there were lots of devices that are being registered by university students. So maybe some of your final year projects might go through the registration of NMRA. So the applications go through this process: generic, approved, and brand new. If it's a completely brand new product, medical device, clinical trials will be required. This is where I had the information. If the device is registered and approved by one of the recognized authorities, for example, Japan, USA, Europe, UK, Canada, Malaysia, Singapore, and there are a few other countries with very stringent rules, they are considered the stringent authorities. If the product is recognized, registered under any of those countries, NMRA will accept that registration and the process will be smooth. If not, you will have to go through the whole process in Sri Lanka. A local agent, so even if the product is registered overseas, you still need to have a local agent. Right? And if the manufacturer is in Sri Lanka, you have to have a site master file, especially for high device disks. Okay, I'm sorry, I know I went through this really fast. Do you have any questions? Right. I did have a group work, but I'm going to skip that and just give you an idea of, so it's not just new products, but if there are refurbished equipments and donated equipment, especially things that are coming into the country, NMRA should look at those also. Refurbished equipments and donated equipments, WHO has a list of guidelines, right? World Health Organization has a list of guidelines. Nobody cares. Right? Nobody cares about medical devices and equipment that they're exporting. Each country only cares about the medical devices that have been manufactured in their country and used in their country, or they're importing to their country. So for example, USA does not care what USA sends to Canada. Canada should care about what's being imported to Canada. Right? I have so many stories because I worked in this field. So many stories I can say, because the Canadian authorities are not as strict as USA. Things that are not suitable, that US FDA has decided is not suitable for USA, gets shipped over to Canada, and because their rules are not so tight, they end up being used in the market in Canada. Right? So each country is responsible for the products that are being used in their own country. So this includes any donated or repaired equipments, or refurbished or repaired equipments, as well as donated. Right. I know I went through this really, really fast because, like I said, I could do this like for the whole semester and still would not be able to cover this. But this is what incorporates everything that goes into medical device regulations. I have not covered specifically some areas because there's no way for me to cover all of this. But If you do want to get a job in this area, at least when you go for an interview, just read up about these things before you face the interview. Right, that brings us to the end of this section. I apologize, I have gone a little bit over time. I do understand you have a lecture in 5 minutes, so I will stop here. You're free to leave. Thank you for interacting with me. If you have any more questions, give them to Dr. Kulesingham, and I will try to do like a video recording or like answer them over email or something, right? And I will stay for 5 minutes. If you have any questions, I can answer. Right? Thank you very much.